Welcome back to Bombastic Nation and Ting and Ting and Ting. I'm Mr. Giant and I'm back with some more vibes for all. Yeah, we're continuing the series on the Crusades. You understand what I'm saying? Ting. And this one's called the First Crusade, Battle of Manzikert 1071. It's a documentary. Now, I did one that says Battle of Manzikert. This one seems a little bit longer, so that most than likely is going to be a little bit more in depth. So I'm going to go ahead and watch it anyway because I might learn something I didn't learn in the other one. Righteousness? Let's YouTube and simmer.
The Roman Empire entered the 11th century with one of its greatest warrior emperors, but by the end, it would take on a path of crisis and decay. It was an ongoing process, peaking at the decisive Battle of Manzikert in 1071. But how did a single defeat under the leadership of a capable general against a heavily outnumbered enemy lead to the loss of the imperial heartland? This is the fascinating story of the event that defined the history of the Eastern Mediterranean and turned a regional conflict into a religious one. Welcome to the first video in our series on the First Crusade. It is the gift-giving season, and if you're looking for a great present for yourself or your loved ones, you don't need to look further than the sponsor of this video, Kamikoto, who provide great Japanese steel knives to solve every cooking situation. Tapping into more than 800 years of traditional techniques from Japan, and using only Japanese steel, Kamikoto created perfect steel knives for your culinary needs. Each Kamikoto knife goes through a rigorous 19-step process that takes several years from start to finish.
Let's fast forward a little bit here and Ting, let's get to the
reign
meat.
of Basil II was the pinnacle of the Eastern Roman Empire, as this emperor of the Macedonian dynasty was a true warrior, capable administrator and cunning diplomat, who managed to endure civil war, defeats and corruption to eventually crush his enemies, including the Fatimids, Georgia, Khazars, and most notably Bulgaria, which he conquered in 1018. When he was not campaigning, Basil wrote laws, established the Varangian Guard, and allied the Kievan Rus under the condition that they accept Orthodox Christianity. The man who would later be nicknamed the Bulgar Slayer would reign for 49 years and leave behind a vast treasury for his successors, all of which would live in the shadow of his memory. The first of these would be Constantine VIII, who ruled for 3 short years, and despite being in his late 60s, he spent most of his time hunting, feasting, and blinding nobles.
What?
Factionalism and court intrigues during his reign showed the cracks in the empire. While he was on his deathbed, he attempted to marry his daughter Zoe to the capable military commander and loyal Duke of Antioch, Constantine. But as the man made his way to the capital, the royal advisors changed the selection to the old and feeble Romanos III, who was easier to control, which was a sign that the empire now preferred court intrigue and plotting to merit and good leadership. Romanos took the throne in 1028 and was eager to prove his worth, so he decided to attack his own client state of Aleppo in July, but that ended in a catastrophic failure, as 20,000 of his men died of heat, thirst, and dysentery. Meanwhile, Empress Zoe was hatching her own plots, spying on her sister Theodora, and in her desperation to get pregnant at the age of 50, took on many lovers, while using magic charms, amulets, and potions to no avail. In 1034, Zoe had her husband drowned in the bath, marrying one of her lowborn lovers named Michael on the very same day. The new emperor, Michael IV, was scared of Zoe and knew what she was capable of, so he had her confined to her chambers, whilst doing his best to restore the strength of the empire. His rule saw significant improvements in the economic sector, as well as a great victory over the Bulgarians.
Man, you gotta put your wife in prison. You gotta put your wife in prison, or you pretty much, banish her to her room so that you could rule. Didn't the populace know this and think, man, he can't even have his wife around? Did they consider him weak? Or smart? Hey, that's trouble. Let's keep that trouble in check. That's crazy.
Who started a major revolt, but neither of those achievements could directly be attributed to him. On the administrative side, there was John the Eunuch, who managed the finances, while the famous Viking Harald Hardrada was the man leading the Varangians to victory in 1041, earning himself the nickname the Bulgar Burner. Meanwhile, the emperor became ill and began to shower the clergy with gifts to both appease them and find a cure, as countless generals wondered why this commoner got on the throne in the first place.
He doesn't have the right pedigree.
Michael
Why is he
IV
there?
died a natural death at the end of the year, and was succeeded by his nephew, Michael V, marking the first time in half a century when the empire was not ruled by an old monarch. However, the tradition of being ruled by an incompetent monarch continued, as Michael immediately arrested Harald Hardrada, banished his uncle John, and later his adoptive mother, Empress Zoe, sparking a major revolt in the capital and causing a mob to raise both Macedonian sisters, Zoe and Theodora, as empresses, while the future king of Norway blinded Michael, ending his 4-month-long reign.
Oh man, he's just blinding people and things
The
like
sisters
that.
now ruled the empire, but before long factions began to form around them, and they schemed against each other until Zoe decided to marry for the third time. Many candidates and former lovers were reviewed, but eventually she settled on Constantine Monomachos, and if the constant coronation sounds confusing, that's because it was. More importantly, the tradition of handing out huge gifts at the coronation ceremony to earn the loyalty of followers exhausted the rich treasury Basil left behind. Shortly after their wedding, Constantine IX brought in his mistress Maria and exalted her to the status of empress, convincing Zoe to share her throne and her bed with this woman, leading to a convoluted situation where the Eastern Roman Empire had an emperor and 3 empresses, who were about to face a wave of new and old opponents. The Byzantine holdings in Italy were crumbling under the wave of Norman invasions. Bulgaria was conquered, but it no longer served as the barrier to other nomadic people, which allowed the Pechenegs to cross the Danube and harass the Balkans. The Kievan Rus launched a huge invasion in 1043, which was stopped with the use of Greek fire. Despite all of these enemies and 2 major failed rebellions, the empire continued to expand, annexing the Armenian kingdom of Ani, a mountainous region that would have made for a good buffer state against the avalanche of Seljuk conquests. Nomadic military traditions met Sunni Islam, and the combination, fueled by the concept of jihad, unleashed itself on the Islamic world, where despite being seen as barbarians by some, the undeniable military prowess of the Seljuks helped them unify most of the Middle East. They now turned their gaze on the Orthodox Romans and Shiite Fatimids. Constantine's reign ended in 1055 with another calamity that would...
So the Shiites and the Sunnis, they've been fighting for centuries. Isn't it amaze you that you have people from the same religious sect, organization, they have different belief system, and then they fight against each other, but they're the same, or they're under the same banner. I mean, like right here where I am, there's so many different denominations of Christianity. I mean, good Lord, there's a church there, I think that's Methodist. There's a Catholic church up there. There's a Baptist church down there, and I think there's a Pentecostal. I mean, all in one block. They're all doing the same thing. The only people that seem to like draw big crowds of them is those televangelists, you know, with the mega churches and thing, making mega money. But but they still have the little battles, like, for instance, I know some people look down on Catholics here. I mean, didn't they say they had an issue with John F. Kennedy being Catholic when he was running for president back in the day? It doesn't make any sense, just doesn't.
Would leave a permanent mark on the empire, the East-West Schism. The throne passed to the only surviving member of the Macedonian dynasty, Theodora, who tried to centralize power, while the court engaged in intrigues and plots. Her death a year later would bring an end to 189 years of rule under the dynasty. Naturally, civil war ensued, and after it, Michael VI and Isaac Komnenos ruled for a year each, until Constantine X Ducas got his chance to start a dynasty. The court was purged, gifts and titles were once again handed out. Meanwhile, the enemies of the empire were only...
Let me see here. There, the ruler is handing out gifts and stuff to get the support of who he needs to. In this modern age, businesses are handing out gifts and monetary incentives to get the government to do what it wants. It cannot flip backwards, you know what I'm saying? That's an interesting little thought coming in there.
Grow stronger. In particular, the Seljuks themselves just had a change in leadership after the founder of the empire, Tugril, died and was succeeded by his nephew, Alparslan. The nomads derived their legitimacy from military success, so the new sultan decided to prove himself by leading an expedition against the city of Ani, which was one of the largest cities in the world at the time. Despite its riches and dense population, its corrupted governor stole gold from the defense budget, and when the Seljuks arrived, they found a section of the city wall unguarded and pounced, subjecting it to a brutal sack in 1064. The last time the Eastern Romans suffered a defeat of this caliber was all the way back in 838, when Amorium was sacked by the Abbasids. Yet Constantinople's only response was not to send an army and pick up the pieces, but to prosecute members of the Armenian clergy, while focusing entirely on the Italian lands they were losing. This complete lack of interest in the eastern frontier was coupled with a disintegration of the professional army, decreased army salaries, lack of repairs on border forts, and reliance
But he'd been
on
giving out
mercenaries.
gifts to people.
Yet it was once again the final act written from his deathbed that was the most influential in the 8-year-long reign of Constantine X. Desperate to keep his dynasty in charge, the dying emperor made his wife, Eudokia, swear an oath in front of all court officials that she would take no future husband and rule as regent until their son could assume the throne. At this point in time, a massive Seljuk raid penetrated deep into Byzantine territory, and the important city of Khazaria was sacked, while the empress discovered a plot by the Duke of Serdica, Romanos, that quickly made her break the oath she swore. Knowing how fragile her position was, and unlike her husband, understanding the importance of keeping the nomadic raiders at bay, she turned to the now imprisoned Romanos and made him an offer. The man was to marry her and defend the empire against its enemies, or die. This was a wise choice, considering the many noble families plotting to seize power for themselves, most notably Constantine's brother John, who, as many notable generals in the past, would defeat their foes only to gain confidence and rebel against the crown. Romanos accepted the offer, and now owed his life to his empress. He wasted no time in preparing against one of the greatest foes the Romans ever faced. Decades of decay and lack of funds had turned the once fearsome army into a mob of peasants and undisciplined mercenaries, which the new emperor had to drill into a competent fighting force. In 1068, news spread of the plunder of Neo-Khazaria, so Romanos set out with a small force and chased the Seljuks for 8 days, until eventually engaging the nomads, slowed down by the loot and slaves they carried. The cargo was abandoned, and the Seljuks rushed back home, making the new emperor confident. Next, he regrouped with the main army to take Hierapolis from the Emirate of Aleppo, wisely avoiding the summer heat, before hearing of yet another raid that sacked Amorium. His first campaign had mixed results, but the soldiers were happy that they finally had a leader who fought alongside them, while his internal enemies did their best to focus on his failures to protect Roman citizens. The following year, another distraction was thrown into the mix, as one of the Norman mercenaries, Robert Crispin, leading a contingent of Frankish troops, rebelled against the empire and attacked tax collectors in Edessa. He was captured and exiled to the island of Abydos, allowing Romanos to continue.
They're always exiling people back then.
A large army went on to secure Aklat on Lake Van, while a smaller force under a sub-commander was ordered to guard the border. That force was overwhelmed, and the Seljuks razed another city, this time Iconium, forcing Romanos to give chase and pick up the abandoned loot after catching up with them. The frustration was building up, as traditional tactics proved ineffective against the lighter
Those people
armed
are in the
cavalry force.
area.
The Byzantine Sultan personally led a campaign to the strategic region around Lake Van in September 1070, taking the cities of Manzikert and Alat, before securing the allegiance of the Mawanids and attacking Edessa. The countryside was plundered, and the city garrison managed to hold off the attackers, but overall Alparslan got what he came for, and could now divert his attention to the real foes in the south, first stopping by the city of Aleppo. The emir of the vassal city was ordered to come out and swear an oath, but he refused, which led to the siege of the city in April 1071. Deciding to use this to his advantage, Romanos quickly gathered his army and marched towards Lake Van in an attempt to retake what was lost. His army included the professional Byzantine corps, as well as Bulgarians, Pechenegs, Oghuz Turks, Armenians and Normans, for a total of 40,000. Every man was ordered to bring enough provisions for 2 months, which, considering the size of the army and the mountainous region, was critical. The host reached Lake Van in August, where the emperor divided his army into 2 equal parts in order to cover more ground, ease the logistical strain, and simultaneously capture both Manzikert and Alat, which were a day's march apart from each other. Upon hearing news of this movement, Alparslan abandoned Aleppo in May and rushed towards the lake with incredible speed, even losing many men who drowned crossing the Euphrates. Romanos and his advisors considered this to be an act of panic and assumed the Sultan would need time to gather new recruits from his domain, while in reality, his forced march was able to surprise the secondary contingent sent to take Alat. The Byzantine force panicked and withdrew to Melitene without sending word to Romanos. The Seljuks numbered no more than 20,000 and had just eliminated an equally large and better armed force with their mere presence. On the next day, August 25th, 1071, the emperor, who had just taken the city of Manzikert, became aware of the Seljuk presence and was baffled to find out half of his men deserted him. He immediately sent out one of his commanders to push back the riders, assuming it was just a scouting party. The commander engaged the enemy, but after realizing this was the entire Seljuk army, he withdrew and reported back to Romanos with 2 spears sticking out of his armor. More troops were sent, but Alparslan once again employed the feigned retreat to avoid casualties and captured a small squadron of men who overextended themselves. Romanos knew that after his reforms and all of the sacked cities, this was his chance to prove himself and eliminate the eastern threat for good, so he ordered an attack against Alparslan. But by that time, the nomads had retreated to a nearby hilltop. The real battle would have to wait, so the Romans went back to their fortified camp just outside Manzikert. Later that evening, the Seljuks launched a devastating raid, taking advantage of the new moon, and harassed whoever was outside the safety of the walls. An eyewitness account reports, "For who could get any sleep when the danger had drawn its sword and pointed it at us?" At dawn, another raid was launched, but it was repelled by the infantry. Shortly afterwards, two messengers arrived, telling Romanos that a group of Oghuz Turks defected and joined the Sultan, and that Alparslan himself wanted to discuss peace terms. The peace talks went on for some time, but the Emperor was aware that should he sign any kind of deal, he would be facing a rebellion back in Constantinople, so he abruptly ended the talks and signaled for his men to form up. Romanos took the center with the cavalry and Varangian guards. The western tagmata made up the left wing, while the right wing was comprised of the eastern units. Finally, the rear was commanded by Andronicus Ducas, the nephew of Constantine X and member of the family which despised Romanos. His presence on the campaign was an attempt to ease tensions, but also as a guarantee that his father would not start an uprising in the capital. The Seljuks deployed their units in a crescent formation, protruding at the wings, with Alparslan leading the center. Romanos, who was an experienced commander and capable fighter, slowly advanced on the enemy under constant arrow fire as they withdrew. Smaller engagements were fought, but eventually, by the end of the afternoon, the Seljuks were pushed back and the Sultan's camp was captured. Romanos quickly realized that his army was losing cohesion and was afraid that if he didn't reform the line in time, the enemy would rampage throughout his camp under the veil of darkness, so he ordered the imperial standard to be reversed, which was the command to withdraw. The fatigued, disorganized and distant wings were confused by this, and some misinterpreted it as a signal that Romanos had fallen. Gaps began to open, and the reserve Seljuk forces
Wow, man, this is something else here.
to go through them and surround the Roman forces, who had just marched over 10 kilometers in heavy armor and were struggling to organize a withdrawal. Seeing this, the rest of the Seljuk forces also rejoined the fight, and it wasn't long before both wings collapsed and began to flee, leaving the center surrounded. The standard was once again reversed in an attempt to rally the troops, but by then it was too late. The only hope left lay in the hands of the rearguard and the Ducas family, who could prevent total disaster, as most of the men were not captured or slain, but merely retreated. It was in that crucial moment when Andronikos announced that the Emperor was dead and marched his men to Constantinople, spreading the word of the death of Romanos through the cities he passed along the way. Back in the camp, the non-combatants were utterly confused and reported it was like an earthquake, with howling, grief, sudden fear, clouds of dust, and finally hordes of Turks riding all around. As darkness set in, Romanos, who had fought despite fatigue and wounds, was captured and his camp was ransacked. Most escaped as the riders were hesitant to blindly chase after the enemy on the mountain roads. And so the young Seljuk Empire matched the Sassanids in capturing a Roman emperor not far from the last time it occurred in Edessa 811 years ago. But rather than killing or humiliating his captive, Alparslan treated him well and with respect. A famous exchange, reported by chroniclers on both sides, quickly followed, as Alparslan asked how he would have been treated if he was captured, to which Romanos replied that he would be killed in a cruel manner. The Sultan instead offered to return Romanos to his home, dressed in the fine clothing of a Seljuk noble, with an escort and any prisoners he wanted to be freed.
You know, that's some crucial thinking there.
A peace treaty was signed, but we will never know if the Sultan anticipated what happened next, for it was the release of a presumed dead Romanos that did irreparable damage to the empire. Back in Constantinople, the nobles immediately tried to distance themselves from their defeated leader and deposed him, quickly replacing him with Michael VII Ducas, who exiled his mother Eudokia. They were well aware that Romanos still commanded respect among the soldiers, and began assembling their own army to defeat him by exploiting the countryside, since the royal treasury was empty. The Norman mercenary Robert was taken out of his cell and led a makeshift army that met Romanos in battle and defeated him, at the expense of many Roman lives. The civil war was brief and ended with the capture of the once mighty commander who pleaded for mercy while he was blinded. An infection quickly set in, and Romanos died soon after. The economy and manpower of the empire were exhausted, and morale was at an all-time low. The Seljuks overran a squabbling state riddled with usurpers and rebellion, and by the end of the decade, the Byzantine heartland was lost. It was in this climate of desperation that a new dynasty would rise and turn towards the west for aid when all seemed lost, hoping for financial or military assistance. Instead, a new chapter would begin as Alexios Komnenos opened the floodgates to the Crusaders. We're soon going to release the second episode in our series on the First Crusade, so make sure you are subscribed and have pressed the bell button to see it. Please consider liking, commenting and sharing it.
Wow. You know what fascinates me a lot about well, it does fascinate me, but maybe baffles me a lot, is how people just marry without love. You know what I mean? Oh, if I don't do this, I can't consolidate power. Let me marry him. Oh, let me make my daughter marry him. And I guess it was part of their duty back then, being in like royal families and stuff. You know, to a certain extent, I think it's the same now, but people are rebelling. I mean, look at the British family royalty. You know, one moved to Canada. You know what I mean? They're just doing their own thing now. But this was quite interesting, man. I'm telling you, man. Kings and generals do the best storytelling, visually and audibly. I'll leave a link in the description so you could go check this out. Check out Kings and Generals, man. That's a really, really, really good channel there. So check them out. Anyway, you all take care of each other, alright? Cool runnings.